All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Generation 180's Electrify Your Bride Week event, electric cars and vehicle-to-grid technology. If you're here to learn more about V2G, then you're in the right place. And if that music didn't pump you up, I don't know what will. So today we're looking forward to hearing from David Slutsky from Fermata and Curtis Wynn from the Roanoke Electric Cooperative, two fabulous industry experts to hear more about the state of vehicle-to-grid technology, as well as how these systems can empower EV owners to support a more resilient electrical grid. Next slide, please. Now, before we get started, I want to quickly tell you all about who we are. So Generation 180 is a national nonprofit based out of Charlottesville, Virginia, working to inspire and equip individuals to take action on clean energy. My name is Blair Sandledger Olson, and I'm joined by my colleague, Stuart Gardner. And a special thank you to our team members working behind the scenes to help make this event happen. So here's a quick look at the three major focus areas of our work. We're working to flip the energy script, helping us to move from a narrative focused on how big the climate problem is to a story focused on where we're going, a world powered by 100% clean energy. A story that says, we can do this, and we all have a role to play. We focus on individuals not because it's all on our shoulders, it's not, but because certain behaviors and technologies not only help to fight climate change, but they also help to build the political will that we need to get big system-level changes. We lead two major nationwide campaigns, Solar for All Schools, which just released the 2020 Brighter Future Report, and Electrify Your Bride, which works to make EVs more accessible for everyone. Solar and EVs are clean energy solutions proven to address two of the largest sources of carbon dioxide, emissions from electricity generation and transportation. As part of our Electrify Your Ride campaign, we host educational events where people can learn more about EVs. This week is full of online events that are great for EV owners, EV advocates, and the EV curious alike. We've got sessions that will dive into EV batteries and workplace charging, policy, expanding access to EVs, and so much more. There's trivia night, a happy hour, and we're even giving away an electric bike. So drop into a few sessions or stay for all 13. It's all free and open to everyone. So a few quick housekeeping items before we dive in. Because of the large number of people joining us today, all event attendees will remain on mute throughout. So please use the Q&A, not the chat, to submit your questions. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can over the next hour. Now, without further ado, let's hear from our guests. Curtis, do you want to kick us off and we'll bring up your slides?
Yes, good morning, Blair, and I'm so glad to be here with you today. This is a very exciting time for our industry. It's a good time for mobility and folks who are looking at different ways to get from point A to point B. I'm happy to join you as the CEO of Roanoke Electric Cooperative. We are a medium-sized distribution electric utility cooperative located in northeastern North Carolina. I'm also happy to join you as the president of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, we call NRECA. And I'll be speaking to you from both perspectives in our comments and questions and answers today. Next slide, please. First, just a little bit about our national network of co-ops. We are located, there's at least one cooperative in 48 states across the country. We power 56% of the nation's land mass, as you can see based on the map in front of you. A little bit more about me, that little green dot is where I'm located. That's our little piece of the world up in northeastern North Carolina. But we join a number of other co-ops that power over 20 million businesses, homes, and schools and farms in 48 states. That's an update we'll make on that slide. We serve 42 million people across 88% of the US counties. And most of those counties, in relevance to what we're talking about today, are persistent poverty counties in the rural areas. We also own and maintain 42% of the distribution lines that serve our communities across the country. So that's a little bit about our national networks. Next slide, please. Something that is very common that's happening in our industry today that is without argument is the pace of change. And actually, as a part of my NREC presidency platform, this is the subject I've spoken the most about. The fact that things are changing. The best way to describe it is to give you a quote from our Vice President of Engineering, George Stamper. He's been in the business about 35 years, and he's actually getting ready to retire here in the next few years. And he's told me many times that he's seen more change in the last 2 to 3 years, and probably we'll see in the last 5 years of his career than he saw in the first 30 plus years of his career. And that really indicates some of the same things that most of us in the field are seeing. We're moving into so many different areas, and this subject today is really relevant to what we're facing as a part of this rapid pace of change. Next slide, please. So this is where I want to spend a little bit of time talking about a common characteristic in our business. And what you're seeing in front of you is titled Managing Load Factor in a Non-Vertically Integrated Environment. What I mean by that is, as electric cooperatives, most of us do not own the entire process of getting power to the home. In many utilities, they own the generation, they own the transmission, they own the distribution. Our co-op, Roanoke Electric, only manages the distribution, which means that we go out and purchase power by way of contracts with another cooperative, in our case, to help manage the G and the T, the generation and the transmission. So at our local level, we are very attuned to something we call two things: the load duration curve, which is that red line that you see running through this graph. And that is the common characteristics of when people use power. Early in the morning and in the afternoon and evening is when we see the highest usage and consumption of power. And then that really has a huge bearing on the capacity that we have to go out and purchase. No one wants to have brownouts or blackouts. So as a utility, we've got to make sure there's power available 24/7, 365. And what that amounts to is that the bottom portion of that top section is power that we have to go out and make commitments for, whether we use it or not. And then the top part of that is the on-demand capacity. So let's talk about that bottom part. We have to purchase committed capacity to make sure that 95% of the power that we need to supply is available. It's called capacity for that reason. But if you look at how that red line goes through, everything above the red line is unused capacity. Everything below the red line is used capacity. And when you get above that first block at the bottom and you get into real tight situations when it's 15, 20 degrees outside early in the morning, and you just don't have enough committed capacity, you got to go out and purchase on-demand capacity. And for me, that costs about $14 per kW a month. And that equates to about $14,000 per megawatt if I have to go out and purchase that. So my goal as a cooperative leader is to raise the red line, to make sure that red line is almost even with the little green line, so that I don't go above it and I don't leave a lot of unused capacity in what I've already paid for. And the way we do that is really relevant to the subject that we're going to be talking about today. We go and find other available resources to make up for that unused capacity. When it's not used, I have the ability to charge a vehicle or a battery. And if that battery is available for me to discharge when I get to a situation where I've got to go out and purchase that $14,000 per megawatt on-demand capacity, it creates a lot of value for me to be able to discharge that battery and avoid going out to do that. I'd much rather share that value with someone local than to go out and have to purchase it on the market. And I think we're going to bring that home as we talk, as David and I discuss what we're looking at as a part of our industry. So I wanted to set the stage with this graph to kind of give you an idea of why this is so important to a utility in terms of efficiency and avoiding extreme costs. So Blair, let me stop there and I'll turn it back to you so we can get quickly to the Q&A and get to David's.
That was perfect. Nate, would you mind bringing up David's slides, and we're going to let him introduce himself next. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Great, and thank you, Curtis, for a perfect introduction to kind of what we're talking about from the utility perspective. So I'm David Slutsky. I'm a founder of Fermata Energy, and I'd like to tell people why I founded Fermata was really for two reasons. I'm trained as a philosopher, so I always do things based on intentions. And my two goals or intentions in setting this up were, number one, to accelerate the adoption of EVs. I've been driving pure EVs since before the Tesla Roadster existed, which means I'm pretty hardcore in the EV world. I have a Ford Ranger pickup truck made in December of 1999, and I still drive it with the original battery pack. But I wanted to accelerate the adoption of EVs because I think they're essential for geopolitical strategic reasons, but mostly for environmental reasons. And the other reason that I wanted to start this company was to enable the accelerated transition to renewables on the power grid. And what's interesting is we'll learn today, those two intentions kind of come together, intersect at vehicle-to-grid technology. On the vehicle side, the biggest obstacle to scale adoption of EVs, in my view, is no longer range anxiety. There's pretty good charging infrastructure out there, and EVs get a lot more range than they did with my truck, for example. But they're more expensive. You pay a little bit of a premium to have an electric vehicle, but yet people buy them to park most of the time. And if they could earn money while they were parked, then they could end up having a more compelling total cost of ownership value proposition than a traditional gas vehicle. And that would be really significant for adoption. On the grid side, the biggest single obstacle to scaling of wind and solar is not the cost of generation. Wind and solar are cheaper to make an electron than nuclear power or coal, for example. The problem with renewables is you need massive energy storage designed into the grid to accommodate the intermittence that generation occurs from renewables. And while California and other places have been both mandating and subsidizing stationary storage, electric vehicles solve that problem and then some, which we'll talk about throughout the panel. So with those two intentions in mind, I just want to sort of summarize Fermata by pointing out, what exactly we do. Traditionally, vehicles provided a single use. They were for driving people around, a logistics duty cycle. When the vehicle wasn't being driven, it was parked. That was it. Electric vehicles disrupt this paradigm because EVs provide a reservoir of uses, many of which benefit third parties that have no interest in the logistics duty cycle of the vehicle. Fermata was founded to identify the many potential value streams inherent in EVs and to enable third-party access to those value streams. Further, Fermata's operating system's designed to optimize access to this reservoir of uses, which in turn maximizes the economic potential of an electric vehicle. So that's kind of in a nutshell, what Fermata is here to do, and we'll get down into the weeds of vehicle to grid, I'm sure, shortly. Thank you.
Thanks, David. And Curtis, that was really good intros. I think, to set the stage, David, maybe you can help us understand in the simplest terms, what exactly is, V2G or vehicle to grid technology? Help us understand what that is.
Sure.
I think we'll bring back your slides.
I was just going to say, I brought a couple of slides that the kind of pictures that simplify the concepts, but then you don't have to look at my face entirely.
But we love looking at you.
So vehicle to grid. So what do you need to do it? First of all, you need to have, next slide would be a good place. One after that, sorry. There we go. So you need three things to do vehicle to grid. You first need a bi-directionally enabled vehicle. And there are some school buses that fit that category right now, and that's a topic we can maybe touch on later. But in terms of the vast majority of vehicles in the US, over 250,000 vehicles are passenger vehicles. And in order for you to do vehicle to grid, you need to have what's called a bi-directionally enabled electric vehicle, which means that the vehicle manufacturer, the OEM, has to agree to let that vehicle be discharged into the grid or into a building. And so they have to specifically enable a function in a vehicle. It's not a significant cost to a vehicle. It's a trivial cost, truly. But the OEM has to agree to make that vehicle bidirectional. And today in the US, there's the Nissan Leaf, which is pictured here. And that one has been fully bidirectional since basically right after Fukushima. And that's not coincidental. They did vehicle to home in Japan in response to that disaster. But the Mitsubishi Outlander, available in California, their hybrid was bidirectionally enabled this year. And there are multiple other OEMs that today have bidirectionally functioning vehicles in the US market, but they haven't freed up that capability yet because they're still studying vehicle to grid, its effect on their batteries and so forth. But next year, there's a couple of models slated to come out in addition to the Leaf. And then the next year after that, there's a whole slew of additional bidirectionally enabled vehicles that will be available for purchase in the US market. But there's 500,000 Leafs sold globally. It's not like they aren't out there and you can't get them. Second thing, next slide, if you will. The second thing you need to do vehicle to grid is a charger. And it needs to be an off-board DC charger, in our opinion. And that's a picture of our first charger, which is a 15 kilowatt bidirectional charger. It's the first UL approved bidirectional charger in the world. And that is a pretty powerful little charger. And that's not the only one that's going to be out there. We only bought a charger company to make a charger for us because none of the charger companies understood the value of bidirectionality. So they didn't make bidirectional chargers until recently. And now we've got the first one out there. It's in commerce. We're deploying them mostly with utilities and fleet customers right now. But there are several more bidirectionally capable chargers that will be coming to the US market starting late this year, and then multiple new offerings next year. So chargers are not a problem. There's one available today, and there's many more on their way in the next 9 months to 2 years. Third thing you need, other than the bidirectionally enabled vehicle and the bidirectional charger, is you need to have software that makes it possible for the car and the charger to integrate with different grid-facing revenue-generating activities. Remember, that car is supposed to earn money while it's parked. Well, it needs to be able to talk to the building, to talk to the utility, to talk to the grid itself. And you need software to do that in a way that is also respectful of the vehicle's primary use, which is that logistics duty cycle that basically paid for the vehicle. And it also needs to be protecting the vehicle batteries against degradation. So you need software that's very sophisticated to efficiently and optimally generate revenue while protecting the vehicle and protecting its primary function. So those are the three things you need: a bidirectional vehicle, bidirectional charger, and software to enable the interoperability. Fermata as a company has all three of those. We have a partnership with Nissan, and we're working with several other major car companies as they bring their bidirectionally enabled vehicles to the market. We have our own charger, but we are not by any stretch a charger company. We're working with multiple charger companies, and that's ultimately what we plan to do, is to work with all the chargers out there, certainly not just ours. And then we have our own software team that was set up specifically to develop the operating of a bidirectional vehicle in the marketplace. So that's kind of the gist of what is vehicle to grid. And I'll just say that as a parting thought in response to that question, the most important piece of this puzzle is not those three things. There are going to be a lot of companies, by the way, that do those three things. We're not going to be the only ones. What's really important is understanding what are the value streams that exist, that are inherent in an EV, and which ones can you unlock today, meaning there's an existing, what we call monetization pathway, an existing thing you can do with that car and that charger today to either save money on your electric bill or earn money by getting a check from somebody. What are the things you can do today, and what are the things that will need regulatory intervention or newly emergent business models to enable the liberation of those additional value streams? And that's what we've spent most of the 10 years of our existence studying, is the utility industry, the grid itself, how buildings interact with electricity, and what can you do today, and what will you be able to do later, and how can we contribute to that ecosystem?
Well, I think
long
you.
answer.
No, perfect. Thank you for setting the stage for all of our attendees. This is complex technology for a lot of us who don't eat, breathe, and sleep this every single day. So really thank you. And thank you both for bringing your expertise to this event. So I think we actually started to hint at this, but I do want to call it out more specifically. In general, why should EV owners be interested in vehicle to grid? And I think you started to talk about that in terms of opening up additional revenue streams. And David, we'll start with you.
I'm sorry, I was reading a question from somebody. You might briefly repeat that, sorry.
Of course. So in general, why should EV owners be interested in vehicle to grid technology? And I think you started to hint at that when we were talking about opening up additional revenue streams.
Well, I think today, actually, there's 2 slides in here that might be helpful to answer that question. If you go to my slides, I think it's the second one or third one. Yeah.
Sorry, Nate, false alarm.
You thought we could put me to bed there. Yeah, the third one is a graphic that shows, yeah, there it is. So on the left is the entire stationary storage industry in the United States. On the right is the storage capacity of just the last 7 years of Nissan Leafs. And mind you, the Leaf, they sell 15,000 Nissan Leafs in a good year. They sell 200,000 Sentras. It's not like it's a wildly selling car. And the older of these models had 24 kilowatt hour packs. Only the last 2 years have had, as an option, a 62 kilowatt hour pack, which pretty much everyone gets. But that group on the right side of vehicles are the entire energy storage industry and then some. So electric vehicles can supplement or displace stationary storage far more cost effectively, because all those stationary storage assets had to be purchased for the single purpose of providing energy storage. The electric vehicles are purchased for their logistics duty cycle, but it also comes with, air conditioning, leather seats, and an enormous amount of storage that could be rented out while the vehicle's parked. So I think it's important for people to understand that renting out the storage is specifically important. And then the last slide, if you can come to, I think if you go, yeah, that one, thank you, perfect. So we've done a demonstration project before we became commercial over a year ago in Virginia. And there's a case study that's going to be published probably later this week by a group called eSource. And they serve the utility industry with a lot of analytics. And they did a third-party study of a case which we did, where we demonstrated that we could make these kinds of dollars with a single Leaf doing a single activity. And what that activity was behind the meter demand charge management. And what that meant effectively is that for commercial customers, they get charged on their electric bill for the kilowatt hours they use. That's a volumetric measure of usage of electrons, but they also get dinged for the load, which was what Curtis's last slide was speaking to, which is how fast they're drawing electrons. The load at which their building is sucking electricity out of the utility and into their building is load. And on your electric bill, commercial bills, you pay a demand charge, kind of like what the utility paid upstream to their generators. Resident or commercial customers pay a demand charge per kilowatt for their highest peak during the month. And if you can shave that peak, which is what we did in this demonstration site, we had 2 or 3 events a month, 15 minutes duration. Most they took was a quarter of the juice out of the battery. And we were able to save a customer hundreds of dollars per month on their electric bill. And the difference on these different bars on this graph are a function of how much a customer pays per kilowatt for their demand charges. So you can make $9,000 a year with a 25 kilowatt hour charger and a $30 kilowatt charge on your demand charges. And there's places actually more lucrative than that, but that's just one revenue stream. It's one you can do today. You don't need special permission to do it. So we're starting by doing a lot of what we call customer bill management activities. But then there's also the service that you can provide to the utility, which is what Curtis's last slide was so perfect at demonstrating. During the utilities load peaking events, utilities have a great deal of pain, if you will. They have to pay dearly for those peaks. And if they could shave those peaks by sending out a signal to a bunch of deployed EVs in their utility district during those peaking events, they would save a lot of money. And some of that savings can be shared with the vehicle owners as well. So hopefully that gives you some sense of what are the things you can do today, but there are multiple other value streams that can be unlocked with this technology, one of which we'll probably talk about later, which is resilience. You can use it for backup power.
Yeah, don't steal my next questions there, David.
Sorry. We didn't see them in advance, so I didn't know that.
Curtis, anything to add to that? You know, EV owners benefits as far as vehicle to grid?
Well, no, I think David has covered it quite well. My only comment would be more fundamental before you get to V2G. Basically your cost of ownership, just without vehicle to grid opportunities, is much less. So that's a very foundational benefit that doesn't even get to the level of pushing or integrating and coordinating with your utility. So that's all I'd add to that.
Perfect.
We've gotten a number of questions similar themed. You know, like last week during Tesla's Battery Day, they talked a little bit about vehicle to grid. And we also have a lot of questions about retrofitting cars, or how do we put pressure on OEMs to make their cars bi-directional, given, you know, it sounds like as far as passenger vehicles, it's really just the Leaf right now. So what can a consumer or organization do to get more OEMs to make their cars able to be bi-directional?
I think that's going to happen on its own, frankly. What's now finally out there in the marketplace is a commercial opportunity to do vehicle to grid and make money. And as multiple utilities around the country and some fleet customers of ours are doing vehicle to grid activity, they're going to start, the utilities will develop programs to reward EV owners for bi-directional activity, and fleet customers will themselves, you know, out of the box be doing building load management and saving money on their electric bill and probably talking about it. And so I think that will put the pressure on the OEMs, but they already feel it. They didn't understand how much money could be made, and they didn't understand how quickly the technology could emerge on the scene. And now that it's here, and now that you can make thousands of dollars per year with an electric vehicle, it's disruptive, because the total cost of ownership of an EV is suddenly going to be less than that of an internal combustion engine vehicle. And in some places, like many parts of California or even Detroit or Massachusetts, New York City, where they have very high demand charges, you can literally get a free car and a free charger in 5 years, which is just kind of mind-bogglingly disruptive. That's hard to say.
Yeah. That actually brings up a really good follow-up question. And to all of our attendees, I'm actually going to launch a poll. So I'll give you a few seconds to take a look at that. But the poll is, do you think electric cars are more suitable or advantageous for higher income or lower income communities? And Curtis, I want to give this question to you first. You know, how does vehicle to grid technology help make EVs more accessible for everyone? And I think you touched upon it just recently.
Yeah, well, if you take the numbers that David just laid out, what really becomes pretty clear is that there's a compelling argument for a win-win situation. In my first slide, in the slide that I showed early on, I was speaking about it from the utility perspective in terms of how we could become more efficient and how we could avoid getting into those high-cost power areas by calling on and integrating and collaborating with the folks who own our business. And the cooperatives, as you probably are aware, we're owned by the members. And we have such an opportunity there, especially in low wealth areas. That's an area of focus that we're getting very aggressive with, because we think there's an opportunity to create that win-win situation and make transportation and mobility even more affordable today than it ever has been. And a little bit about my service territory, we are probably in, I would say, one of the poorest 10 congressional districts in the country. So we have a lot of challenges in terms from a financial perspective of people just figuring out how to make ends meet. but they still have to get to work, whether they're going to work for a minimum wage job or whatever the case may be, they still have to get to work. So I think that it is more suitable, in my opinion, for a low income community than it would be otherwise because of the value that it creates. And for the member-owned utility to be a catalyst in making that work is very intriguing to us as an electric cooperative in a community that so badly needs someone to help them address the pocketbook issues. As cooperatives, we're looking at the total energy costs that our member owners are having to deal with, not just the electricity costs. So when you have the opportunity to combine the two, another type of fuel with what we do on a day-to-day basis, it gets into a term we call beneficial electrification and how we can make that a reality for our member consumers. So I think it creates huge opportunities for the utility to be a catalyst in making sure that this technology is well suited and available to low and moderate income households.
That's great. And I want to flag, I'm sharing the poll results. Our audience, 52% of y'all do agree. And if I reran this poll, I'd probably get different numbers, but we're about 50-50, 48% think it's for higher income communities, and that's completely fair. And 52% think lower income communities. So glad to see everyone's engaged on this, but I want to let David also add his contributions to this question as well.
Yeah, I think, Curtis, you teed up a kind of a critical issue, which is access to electric vehicles for economically disadvantaged people is going to be a huge challenge. But what's interesting is one of the reasons why low moderate income folks don't have as much access is because you have to pay a premium for an EV over a regular vehicle. So by the disruption of total cost of ownership, that certainly favors lower income families. But you also have to recognize that the idea of vehicle ownership itself, while it's needed to get to work, is also a cost center for a household that's pretty significant if they're going to own that vehicle just to get to and from work or to the grocery store to church. What they need, what you will probably see very quickly emerge are new vehicle ownership models where vehicles are owned by a business and they rent out the driving duty cycle, which has high value. But while those vehicles are parked, then they extract those vehicle to grid revenues to offset the cost of ownership of a vehicle. So I think you will see a lot of interesting change in how Americans interact with their vehicles in the coming years. But we're working with a low-income housing project in Boston to deploy a couple of vehicles, bi-directional vehicles and a couple of bi-directional chargers where it's offered as a building amenity. So the building owns the vehicles and the tenant could rent it out when they need to go somewhere. But while it's sitting there parked, it's not just rotting, it's earning money for the building owner. So they're fine whether it's being used by their tenants or being driven around. I think you're going to see a number of interesting utilization models emerge in the face of this that will favor low moderate income families significantly.
I think we all saw last week, California announced that they were going to ban the sale of ICE vehicles by 2035. And
new ICE vehicles. All you collector car enthusiasts, you're fine.
And then on Saturday, Bloomberg News had an article that said electrifying California cars could crush the grid or save it. What's your thoughts on vehicle to grid and whether or not the grid will be crushed or saved by something like that?
David or Curtis, either one of you, if you want to take us off.
I'll take a stab at that. Stuart, that is even more motivation for me as a utility executive to get ahead of this, because it could very easily crush our utilities if not managed and if there's zero involvement by the utility. So our goal would be to help make it easy for those bi-directional chargers to be installed. As a matter of fact, we have a pilot program going right now for just normal electric vehicles, not with the V2G chargers, but just with the regular chargers, where we will cover the upfront costs and the installation for anyone who goes out and purchases an EV. And the reason we want to do that is to provide a an incentive for them not to go home at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon and plug it in and add to that peak that you saw on the graph earlier.
Yeah.
And that creates an adverse impact that will cost us tons of money. We want just the opposite to happen. So by having some involvement with the potential consumers who are now becoming prosumers, making sure that they understand the impact of that is critical. So it's incumbent upon the utilities to really get involved in this to make sure that what you just described does not happen.
Mm-hmm.
If I
Yes,
can just
David?
add, I had the pleasure of meeting Curtis the first time when we worked together on a webinar that was put on by the Department of Energy in DC. Or actually it wasn't a webinar, it was live back in the old days, I forgot. And Curtis, you brought up a comment that I wrote down and vividly remember to this day, which hadn't, frankly, I'm embarrassed to say, occurred to me, which is that if everybody does go out and charge at 4 o'clock in an unmanaged ecosystem, we all understand how much of an adverse impact that will have on utility load management. But you pointed out that even if customers go home and don't add to load because they're doing behind the meter load management, that's a problem for the utilities because you don't know what's happening behind the meter. As far as you can tell, they maybe all turn their lights off or their HVAC down, but you don't know who did it, you don't know when, and it kind of messes up your predictive algorithms for operating the utility's ability to dispatch power where and when it's needed. And so it's important to have vehicle to grid as part of a managed ecosystem. So you don't want to just have individual vehicle owners doing their own thing. You want to have them do it through a managed ecosystem operated by, properly credentialed, properly authorized vehicle to grid services providers. And that's really what we're working towards. We can protect the vehicle battery that way to the satisfaction of the utilities, but most importantly, we can address the enormous threat that an expansion of EVs in the marketplace could represent to the utility industry and the grid, and turn that around and make it an enormous value add to the stability of the utility industry and the grid.
Yeah,
That's fantastic. And perfect timing. It is now 10:40. So we have 20 minutes left, and thank goodness, because the Q&A is blowing up, y'all. Thank you so much. We have over 20 questions that we're going to try to get through. So we're going to shift now to your Q&A. We'll try to move into, we'll move in as thoughtful a series of these questions as possible. But if you feel like we're bumping around and bouncing question to questions, because we're trying to get them all answered. But I think an interesting follow-up is from Bob Erdman from EVADC. Thank you for joining us, Bob. And his question is, does it make any difference to utilities whether an EV with V2G is just a stationary battery in a consumer's garage is used for storage? Or just a stationary battery in a consumer's garage is used for storage? Curtis, would you like to start with that one?
I don't think, as long as the ability to call on that resource is available, whether it has wheels or not, it really will depend on. It's something David and I have talked about on some of the panels that we've sat on, is what is the consumer tolerance and trust factor in terms of allowing a utility to draw from something that may be needed, unpredictably maybe needed to go on a trip somewhere or an emergency. But I think with the right levels of technology, if you're calling on that resource as a vehicle resource, we just have to be smart and know what the consumer behaviors are. And with the right technology, we can get to that level of knowledge to know, well, this consumer isn't comfortable getting their battery below 50%. And we got to know that that's the limit for them. And we got to be flexible and adjustable enough to make sure that we don't create any unneeded anxiety for the consumer as we use that resource. So I think that's one of the nuances we have to really keep into consideration when you're working with a vehicle battery versus a stationary battery. You don't have as many complexities.
Yeah, David.
Just two quick thoughts on that. A very good point, Curtis. But utilities have had kind of stagnant kilowatt hour business for a while, and a massive deployment of electric vehicles will actually be good for the utility space in the sense that it will grow their kilowatt hour business. But So I think in that sense, utilities probably are happy to see EVs deployed, as long as it's done in a way that doesn't, blow things up, that it's managed. And the other thought is that the difference between stationary storage and electromotive storage is that the electromotive storage, those electrons are basically paid for by the logistics duty cycle of the vehicle. So it's a more cost-effective way for a utility to access storage if they don't have to, in effect, pay for a battery. They're just paying for the delta between the two vehicles.
Here's a question about what will it take to get permissions from EV manufacturers and regulators to do this? Is it a situation where you need to get permission, or once the software is in the vehicle, it flows? What's the regulatory side or the permission side of that?
If I can just jump in on that one. So on the regulatory side, as I mentioned, you can do behind the meter demand charge management today. You just need to have a bidirectional charger that has a UL 1741 certification, and that's what is the benchmark for getting to connect to the grid. And ours has that, and others are going to. So regulatory intervention is going to be required to unlock some of those more esoteric value streams, maybe very lucrative, but for which there isn't a mechanism today for a customer to be rewarded for providing a response to a utility or a grid pain point. But the right now today, the vehicle manufacturers don't need to be made to do it. They're going to want to do it. They just have to be measured and thoughtful, study their own electrochemistry in the face of the different duty cycles or use cases that vehicle to grid exercise might imply, and become comfortable that the vehicle to grid services providers are doing those things necessary and allocating their resources to protect the battery. There's a study that was done in the UK a few years ago that actually said that in a properly managed vehicle to grid ecosystem, that you could extend the life of an electric vehicle battery doing some of those things that we were able to do with it today, because it's being managed versus everybody coming home at 5 o'clock and plugging in, which is problematic for the grid, but it's also problematic for the battery, because if it stays fully charged all night, that's not as good for battery health as having it exercised a little bit during the course of the night.
No.
Awesome. And that actually brings up a follow-up question. And I think, Curtis, this is really for you and your customers, in that how do we get EV owners to understand, once we're seeing more adoption of vehicle to grid technology in everyone's cars, how do we get EV owners across groups like yours and co-ops and utilities to understand this technology, as well as to know that it's taking place and to agree to participate in it?
Yeah, that's it's really an educational challenge, and I'd say that not in the sense that it's insurmountable, but we can get there. It's just we got to realize that it does take education. And one of the things one of the tactics I will say that we've used is to try not to get too bogged down into the jargon of rates and time of use. Talk in terms of, with an ICE vehicle, it's this. With a V2G vehicle or an electric vehicle, it means this, in terms of what does it mean to the consumer, not so much what it means to the utility. I think that's where we get bogged down, is trying to speak to the consumer in terms that they're not familiar with.
Awesome. Thank you for that.
Two kind of quick questions, perhaps. One is, what is behind the meter load management? We've heard that mentioned a couple of times. And two, does the vehicle to grid, the transfer of energy, does that have any negative effect on the battery? So either one of you can take those.
David, I'll take part A if you'll take part B.
You guys are great.
What a team.
Behind the meters, it is a very broadly used term, and it applies to what utilities have always considered a point of demarcation as far as its responsibility. The meter out towards the generation facility has always been just the utility's responsibility, and we've never cared about what was inside of the home. Behind the meter, what that means is the thermostats, the water heater controls, anything that is controlled by the member or the consumer is considered behind the meter. So the charging activity that we're talking about today is behind the meter. So what it requires is really an interaction and a collaboration with the consumer so that we create those win-win situations that will not allow or not create a situation where they're adding to the challenges of the utility, but creating value streams that will allow both the utility and the consumer to benefit.
Perfect. And then the kind of the second half was, what about battery degradation impact, to summarize the question. And I spoke to it a little bit, but if you, the kinds of things, think of it this way: you're a car company and you have an 8-year, 100,000-mile warranty. You can look at your watch or at your calendar and know how you're moving through the 8 years. That's pretty clear. You can track the miles by looking at the odometer. But if people are using their vehicles while they're parked extensively in vehicle to grid activity, the OEMs have a real concern that that vehicle's being used, but it's not showing up on the odometer or on the calendar. So how do they make sure that they're not going to have to pay out a claim for a battery failure in year 6 or 7 because it was overworked during vehicle to grid activity? So the OEMs the car companies have to become comfortable that their particular electrochemistry can be utilized well in a vehicle to grid service environment without having the car company to have to replace a whole bunch of batteries early. So they are going to do simulation studying, what are the use cases that are likely to occur. And what I predict will happen as vehicle to grid becomes scaled is that you'll not only need to have your charger approved by the vehicle manufacturer, but also you'll have to have the vehicle to grid services provider approved, or you won't be allowed to do bidirectional activity, because then the OEM can enter into agreement with the services provider, like a Fermata, to not do certain things more than a certain amount over a certain period of time to be able to match the ability of that battery to function well within those confines. And what we know about battery degradation, I have a day job running Fermata, but I also teach at UVA in the engineering school. We study battery degradation pretty extensively, and it's a fascinating topic. But the bottom line is that vehicle to grid really can, if properly deployed, extend battery life. And it certainly doesn't have to degrade it beyond the point where it will create problems for the OEMs. And that's why I'm very comfortable, and in fact know that multiple OEMs will be unlocking this vehicle to grid capability in their vehicles very quickly because they become comfortable with it. But they will probably end up doing it through vehicle to grid services providers.
That's awesome. Thank you guys so much for answering that question, and got a good follow-up, I think. So from Gary from Clean Fuels, Ohio. Thanks, Gary, for joining us. Will new bidirectional charging for EVs support bidirectional AC charging only, bidirectional DC charging only, or both? David, you're up.
Probably, yeah. So we could do any, and you can do AC and you can do DC. The challenge with AC, well, there's onboard and offboard. So if you're going to have onboard, your challenge with that is the vehicle now has to get an interconnection agreement if it's going to discharge into a utility, and it literally would have to have an interconnection agreement at every plug outlet potentially that it's going to maybe plug into. We call it the roving inverter problem. So an onboard solution is problematic today in the regulatory environment, and for good reason. Over time, that may play itself out. There may become utility efficiencies, economic efficiencies gained from having onboard solutions. But for the foreseeable futures, it's going to be off-board. And when you're doing off-board, DC is just a more effective solution. That's what we're going with. But if somebody's got an off-board DC or AC solution, we're agnostic ultimately as to the type of charger. And if an OEM comes out with an onboard solution, they figure out a way around this roving inverter problem, we can operate those too. So the technology itself isn't dependent upon off-board DC. It's just that the practicality of execution and implementation has us targeting that initially.
Great. Stuart, you're muted. Had to happen at least one event. Welcome to 2020, y'all.
Thank you, because I was thinking some really insightful things. So a good question. Why would an EV owner want to do this in the first place? Is will the electric company pay the EV owner? What's, you know, we understand the benefit that the utility would get from people plugging in, but what's the business case or the rationale for the person at home with an electric vehicle that's V2G capable?
And I think that's in addition to the potential money that that person can make, but rather, why would the EV owner want to let the electrical company take the energy that's already being stored in their battery if that EV owner wants to use it for themselves?
Right. And that's a good question. And there are some indicators that are already moving us in that direction. I'll just use right now with thermostats as an example, and water heater controls. Utilities are commonly giving rebates to get the consumer to participate in load management or demand response. So when we're approaching a spike, getting to that point, we're about to have to go out and purchase that, in this case, our case, $14 per kW month power. It makes sense to give an incentive to the customer that would encourage them to adjust that thermostat and help us avoid that. So the shared value is already happening where we're sharing that value with the customer. And this would be the same as we look at purchasing or using the storage in that battery that's sitting idle. Short answer, yes, there are all kinds of ways that we would want to purchase that resource versus one that's going to cost us a ton more. I think that's where David's numbers really start to really make sense, is in how this collaboration with the utility could really mean a revenue stream for the consumer. Technology's got to get us there, and I know that's something that David's working on and getting us to that point where we can coordinate that, but it makes for a true value proposition, especially for a member-owned electric cooperative like the company I work with.
Mm-hmm. David, do you have anything to add there?
I think Curtis nailed it. The utilities will end up providing the incentive for customers or members to provide those value streams that the utility wants. And any revenue that an electric vehicle can generate while it's parked is a win for the owner. So I don't think that this is a challenged proposition. It just needs to, be sorted out in its details, and that's happening in real time.
Fantastic. All right, so we've got 5 minutes left, and in those 5 minutes, I want to use them thoughtfully. So all of our participants, when you first joined this webinar, we gave you a couple of different polls, and we're going to ask you those same two questions now after hearing from our experts. And as you're answering those, David and Curtis, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you're most excited about in terms of the future. David, you only have 5 minutes. You have to pick one.
Should let Curtis go first. That's only fair.
Well,
all right, so I'm going to launch these polls, but Curtis, why don't you kick us off?
I'll be brief because I know David deserves more time because of his expertise in this area. What I'm most ecstatic about is the day when I can see in this community that it's probably unheard of or unthought of, that we'll see members and some of our customers in this community rolling around in EVs and driving up to their homes, charging those vehicles and working closely with us to help lower the cost that it takes to provide them good quality, affordable electricity. We're all in this together, and they're winning, we're winning. That day is coming. That's why we've started collaborating and working with Gen 180, because I know that Larry and Stuart's going to help us get there with their expertise.
Yes, we are.
But we see that day coming, and I'm truly excited about how we can make that become a reality for this community. So that's my piece, David. The rest is your time.
I'll try to be efficient. Hard for me. I'm a chatty guy. But for me personally, as I mentioned at the beginning, I started Fermata because I wanted to accelerate the adoption of EVs, and I wanted to accelerate the transition to renewables. So for me personally, the ability to offer massive energy storage to address the absence of energy storage in the grid will inevitably accelerate the transition to renewables. And for me, that's a big win. I spent my entire life focused on environmental issues, so I care deeply about that one. I like to see the grid stability outcome that vehicle to grid implies, because the grid has challenges, and if we do transition to EVs, they will potentially, as Curtis's earlier slides kind of suggested, they could be really disruptive and problematic for the electricity providers at the grid level and the utility level. if it's not done in a managed, thoughtful way. Vehicle to grid as a technology opens up this vast opportunity to stabilize the grid as opposed to destabilize the grid, while still expanding on the deployment of electric vehicles to the benefit of the environment, and with the added bonus of providing that massive energy storage needed to accommodate the transition to renewables on the generation side of the utility business. So I'm excited about all those outcomes, and I think they're inevitable. I think the obstacle has been, and we've touched on it a couple of times, people don't understand vehicle to grid. They don't know how valuable it's going to be. Now that it's finally here and it's earning money and people are starting to discover it, there's a holy cow moment going on around the country. And I think you're going to see this technology emerge very, very quickly and scale very quickly. And we're looking forward to contributing to that.
Awesome.
Thank you both so much. That's fantastic. And I'm very happy to see in the poll results that this conversation has helped a lot of people not only consider an EV that is V2G enabled for their future car, but also to help realize that V2G technology is a key component to helping make EVs more accessible and can be a fantastic solution for LMI communities. So thank you guys so much for helping us drive those 2 points home. It's so important. In our last, I'm gonna guess 45 seconds, I just wanna thank you both so much. To all of our attendees, thank you guys for fantastic questions. We are recording all of them that we didn't get answered. You guys sent us in 40. I don't even know why I bothered creating questions in the first place. You guys clearly handled it. And we'll try to make sure those get answered. If you want to be connected to our panelists, please feel free to give me an email at Blair, BLAIR, @generation180.org. And we'll try to answer any remaining questions that you might have. And last but not least, this recording will be posted, or this event recording will be posted at the end of the week once we get all of the events recorded. And I hope you guys join us for even more.
Yeah.
So thank you, everyone.
And check out the rest of our week's events as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for
right.
having us.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Curtis.